Astronomer and best-selling author Dr. Hugh Ross travels the globe speaking on the compatibilities of advancing scientific discoveries with the timeless truths of Christianity. His organisation, Reasons to Believe, is dedicated to demonstrating via a variety of resources and events that science and biblical faith are allies, not enemies. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Ross, because I know that you're a very busy man. You just told us off there that you're currently writing 4 books, so it's fair to say you haven't got much time on your hands. How do you manage to find the time for 1 book, never mind 4, and do you write them all at the same time?
Well, I don't play golf and I don't fish, so that saves a lot of time.
Why did you decide to set up Reasons to Believe?
Well, I was an astronomer at Caltech and a pastor in a church near Caltech, and people just kept saying, hey, you're in the pastoral ministry, you're an astronomer, how do you resolve science and faith? So I was just so busy answering questions that people said, hey, you need to do this full time. That combined with the fact that I was alerting people every day there are scientific discoveries that give us more evidence for the Christian faith. And people around me said, you've got to start communicating this.
And your branch of science deals with, is it fair to say, the cosmic? So I'd like to ask you, does astrophysics tell us how the universe began? Because it's the big question, isn't it? How did it all happen?
Oh, it was actually astronomy and physics that brought me to the Christian faith 8 years before I really got to know Christians. And yes, it's in astronomy where we have compelling evidence that the universe has a beginning. You know, the power of astronomy, it's the one science discipline where we directly access the past. We have no evidence of the present, but because of the velocity of light, we can see what was happening in the past. And that's where we find the powerful evidence that, yes, the universe not only has a beginning, even space and time have a beginning, which implies there must be a causal agent beyond space and time that created our universe.
And from that, does it tell us whether there's a God or not?
Well, it tells us there's an agent beyond space and time that created the universe, and that could apply to any kind of God. But when you look at the fine-tuning of the universe, how over 100 different features of the universe must be exquisitely fine-tuned to make possible the existence of life and human beings in particular. And what particularly impresses me is all of this fine-tuning is for the express purpose of making possible the redemption of billions of human beings. And that's the God of the Bible.
I was just about to ask, because how do we know that it's the Christian God who created the universe? There seems to be so many gods potentially out there. How do we know that it's ours who created the whole universe?
Very good question. What you see in the Eastern religions is God or gods or cosmic forces creating within space and time that eternally exists. The Bible explicitly says that God created independent, outside of space and time. Space and time didn't exist until he created the universe. So that establishes that it's the God of the Bible. The other thing that helps is when you compare Christianity against other biblical faiths like Judaism and Islam and Mormonism, those religions don't have God as intimately involved with this creation as Christianity does. And that's where the fine-tuning argument comes in. And those other religions also don't have the same message of redemption that you see in the Bible. So the fact that we see that the earth in particular, all of Earth's life, has been designed in such a way as to open up a tiny window in which billions of human beings can hear the gospel message of salvation through Jesus Christ. This again tells us it really is the God of the Bible and it's the God of Christianity.
And it's fair to say that you didn't just stumble upon Christianity. You did your research before that on other faiths and what they believed, didn't you?
I did. I mean, it was astronomy that told me there had to be a God beyond space and time. Then I began to look at the great philosophers of the world and the holy books that undergird the religions of the world. And after 2 years' study of 1 or 2 hours a night, I recognized that, yes, it's the Bible that gives us the correct revelation of this one that created the universe. And that's what led me to sign my name in the back of a Gideon Bible, giving my life to Jesus Christ.
He's probably a name who you hear lots about. It's a typical question about Stephen Hawking because he is one of the world's most famous scientists and he doesn't believe that there is a God. So you're a very clever man, you're a scientist as well. What would you say that Stephen Hawking doesn't believe that you do, and what evidence has he seen to believe that there's not a God that you have seen to believe that there is a God?
Well, the irony is that he was one of two authors that produced the first of the space-time theorems, a theorem that establishes there must be an agent beyond space and time that created everything. But I've got a book here in my library which is based on a semester-long course at Cambridge University where Stephen Hawking had a friendly debate with his research partner, Roger Penrose, on the universe and God. And reading the book, it seems to me that Stephen Hawking is defending deism, whereas Roger Penrose is defending theism. The difference is that Roger believes that there's purpose behind the universe, whereas I think Stephen's position is, yes, there's some kind of causal agent, but it's not a personal being. And, Stephen actually indicated in his book, A Brief History of Time, that the reason why he rejects a personal God, he wants to know everything that God knows. And he says, I'm not just talking about physics, I'm talking about everything. And, that to me is a mark of hubris, this idea that we human beings can be as smart, as intelligent, and as powerful and all-knowing as the one that created this incredible universe that still has mysteries we can never comprehend.
Do you ever look at other scientists and almost feel frightened or maybe doubt your own faith and think, well, maybe they've got a theory or they've thought about this a bit deeper than me, and if I read the same text that they do or if I speak to the same people that they speak to, I may well become atheist or start to doubt my faith?
Well, I engage scientists frequently in my ministry. I mean, a lot of my speaking's on university campuses. We love to put out our biblical creation model and invite unbelieving research scientists to critique our model. And actually, we've seen some scientists come to faith in Christ through critiquing our model. So what's interesting is that the more I engage my secular peers who are not believers, it actually strengthens my faith. It doesn't weaken my faith, especially when I see several of them actually abandoning their atheistic worldview and becoming Christians. But I would argue we Christians can only benefit from rigorous criticism of our biblical beliefs. This is what helps us to research and develop even stronger evidences for our faith.
Because, of course, there is a common belief by atheists that science has disproved most of what Christians believe from the Bible. But that's not the case, is it?
Well, it's not the case, but I have some sympathy with them because typically they've been hearing biblical interpretations that have no theological credibility. So, for example, a lot of my scientist friends who call themselves atheists think we Christians believe that the universe is less than 10,000 years old. And they understand that the creation days in Genesis are 6 consecutive 24-hour periods. And so I reach out to them by saying, hey, look at the text. There's no evening and morning for the 7th day. There are 3 texts outside of Genesis that tell us we're still in the 7th day. It's a day when God stops creating. And notice we don't see any speciation in the human era, but we do see lots of speciation evidence in the pre-human era. And then they begin to understand, the Bible is not contradicting Big Bang cosmology. It's not contradicting billions of years. It actually has historical and scientific credibility. So a lot of my ministry is just helping people get past their misconceptions of what they think the Bible teaches.
Do you feel that science has disproved anything that the Bible has to say and teach?
Well, I spent 2 years going through the Bible looking for provable historical or scientific error. I did find passages that I didn't understand, but I was unable to find a single provable error or contradiction. Contrast it with my studies of the other holy books, where I found dozens and in some cases hundreds. So that was one piece of evidence that told me this book that was written thousands of years ago that accurately predicted future scientific discoveries, that actually wrote about Big Bang cosmology thousands of years before any scientists had a clue that's the kind of universe we live in. I said, the only possible explanation, this book must be inspired by the one that actually did all the creation deeds.
And just before that, you did touch upon this slightly, but some people believe that the universe is only a few thousand years old, whereas others believe, and you hear this quite frequently in the media, that it's billions of years old. Which side do you go with on this argument?
I'm an Old Earth Creationist. I believe that the creation days in Genesis 1 are 6 consecutive long periods of time, just based on what it says in the text, how the 6th day and the 7th day clearly are long periods of time, and the grammatical structure would tell me all 6 are. So yes, I believe that the universe is 13.79 billion years old. We got overwhelming measurements in astronomy that prove that, and everything in the Bible is consistent with that position.
It's fair to say that in your line of work and study, you are working with some humongous numbers. I mean, to even comprehend the size of the universe, it does make our brains hurt and ache a little bit, because for us, a long time is 100 years. But when you're thinking of billions and billions of years, that's just mind-blowing. How does this fit in with the story of Adam and Eve?
Well, what's interesting is if you go back 100 years, astronomers were thinking the universe was quadrillions of years old. And it was a discovery of Big Bang cosmology that told us, no, it's really quite young. It's only billions of years old. And as you look at the Bible, yes, the days are long periods of time, but notice that Adam and Eve are created at the end of the 6th creation day. That would indicate that humanity is relatively recent upon the terrestrial scene. I would date Adam and Eve as sometime during the last ice age. Why? Because Genesis 2 tells us that when God created Adam and put him in the Garden of Eden, 4 known rivers joined together in the garden. And those 4 known rivers only come together in what is now the southeastern portion of the Persian Gulf. And the southeastern portion of the Persian Gulf was dry land during the last ice age. So that tells me that, according to the Bible, God created Adam and Eve sometime during the last ice age, which is sometime between, say, 15,000 years ago and 130,000 years ago. Relatively recent on a cosmic scale.
What sort of answer would you give to people who say, well, we've got Adam and Eve, where did it go from there? You've got 2 people, you can't possibly believe that billions of people came from just these 2 human beings.
Well, keep in mind that Genesis tells us that the first few generations of humanity had the capability of living 800 or 900 years. And they didn't have very good birth control methods back then. And it tells us in Genesis 5 that in addition to Cain and Abel and Seth, that Adam and Eve had many sons and daughters besides. I calculate that they must have had at least 150 children. And if every couple is giving birth to 150 children, you get a very rapid population explosion. So, and we notice, too, that until the book of Exodus, evidently it was morally acceptable for brothers and sisters to marry one another. After all, Abraham was married to his half-sister. And in the early generations, there would be very little genetic risk of propagating any kind of defect. It's not until humanity's been here a long time that it would not be wise for brothers and sisters to marry. And notice in Exodus, from that point forward, it is forbidden. So, in that sense, I can see where Cain got his wife. I can see where he got the people to build a city. He only had to wait a few decades before the population would have exploded sufficiently to make that possible.
With that theory, though, the question that springs to mind, you mentioned that Adam and Eve could have had several hundred children. Is it believable that one female body could actually produce 100 odd children?
Well, if people have the potential to live 900 plus years and they're reproductive for 2/3 of their lifetime, and they don't have good birth control methods, that's a minimum of 150 children that would be born to Eve. And if she had the strength to live 900 years, I think she surely would have had the strength to bear 150 plus children.
We will just touch upon that again about the age of some people in the Old Testament. 900 years some people live till. We're lucky if we live till 100 years old. So how would you explain people living to such a ripe old age?
Well, what you notice in the early chapters of Genesis is that people were on a vegetarian diet. You must be on a vegetarian diet if you're going to want to live that long. But the other thing I notice, in fact, you'll see this in my book, Navigating Genesis, there's a British astronomer, Wolfendale, and a Russian astronomer, Erlikon, that have done 40 years of research on these killer cosmic rays. And they concluded in several research papers that over 90% of those killer cosmic rays come from a single supernova eruption that erupted sometime in the last 100,000 years. That might at least in part explain why people living before Noah could potentially live that long, and people living after Noah were not able to live that long. People after Noah would have been exposed to significant cosmic radiation. People living before Noah would not have been exposed. The other thing you notice is the biblical text says humanity living in sedimentary plains until after the flood. If you live in sedimentary plains and you don't have extensive transportation arteries, then you probably are going to have most of the population not exposed to igneous rocks. If you're not exposed to igneous rocks, you're not going to be impacted by the radiometric decay of uranium and thorium in those rocks. And so I, for one, see the potential for human beings living as much as 800 or 900 years before the time of Noah, and not able to do so after the time of Noah. And there's more in my book, Navigating Genesis, that gives a scientific defense of that position. Nevertheless, I would argue that the longest average lifespan is probably what we experience today. Because what it tells us in the early chapters of Genesis, the vast majority of the human population did not die a natural death. Rather, they were being killed off by murderous, wicked people that lived around them.
You also mentioned then about the diet of human beings, and a vegetarian diet would have helped people to live longer. But I always imagined early human beings would have eaten potentially more meat then that we eat now because of the teeth maybe, and how the human body is potentially designed and created to digest meat.
Yes, meat is easier to digest. But if you eat meat, you will concentrate heavy metals in your body, and it's not going to really do any health damage until you get to be past, say, 200 years of age. If you live that long, then the eating of meat will accumulate enough metals in your body that it will bring about your demise. And in Navigating Genesis, I also make the point that if you want to live 800 or 900 years, the telomerase activity in your chromosomes cannot be as aggressive as it is in our current chromosomes. And so I believe God must have intervened in such a way after the flood to shorten, to increase the shortening of our chromosomes with respect to time. That actually lengthens our life. Because of chromosome shortening, no one today can live much beyond 120 years. However, if you don't have cosmic rays and exposure to uranium and thorium, then you don't need to have such aggressive chromosome shortening to extend your lifespan. So there's multiple factors that must be taken into account in order to have people to live 800 or 900 years.
Previously, I have heard you talk about the fact that other planets are where they are, and it's crucial that they are where they are in order to protect Earth. So my next question would have to be, could it not just be the fact that human beings have developed to live in the environment that they were placed in rather than the environment created for human beings to live in?
Well, when you look at the universe, you mentioned earlier just how vast the universe is. We astronomers have got a good measure of just exactly how vast it is, how massive it is, and we realize is it must be exactly the mass and the size that it is in order to even have one planet in the entirety of the universe capable of having life upon it. But everywhere we look in the universe, in our galaxy, we see conditions that are hostile for advanced life. And we recognize that every single planet and every asteroid and comet belt in our solar system plays a critical role in making possible advanced life here on planet Earth. The evidence for fine-tuning design is utterly overwhelming, and it gets stronger by about a factor of 1,000 times with every month of ongoing scientific discovery. So this tells me that we just don't happen to be accidentally on a planet that is able to support us. It really looks like there's purposeful design to make possible our existence here on planet Earth. And particularly when I recognize that the window in which billions of human beings could live on our planet is only about 10,000 years wide. So the fact that the timing has to be exquisitely fine-tuned, in addition to all the characteristics of the Earth, tells me somebody purposely designed it this way for our specific benefit.
Are you fairly confident then that there's no other planet in the universe which is as perfect for life as Earth is?
Well, I can't rule that out because we haven't seen everything, but everywhere we look, we see conditions that are hostile for advanced life. And I think one of the more persuasive evidences of that is we can't even find a star that's sufficiently like our star, the Sun, to be a candidate for advanced life on a planet orbiting it. Or as we look at other galaxies, we've yet to find a spiral galaxy that has the features that are necessary for the sustenance of advanced life. Kind of spoiled my enjoyment for Star Wars because we've looked far, far away and we don't see any galaxies that could be appropriate candidates. So far at least, it looks like our galaxy, our solar system, our planet Earth are unique in a capacity to sustain advanced life.
If there was to be, in the next few years, a finding of a planet which mirrors Earth, in the future we visit this planet and we find that actually there's fossils of life on those planets, where does it leave us as Christians in our Christian faith?
Well, I don't think it would disturb our Christian faith at all. It would simply tell us that God is so compulsively creative, he did it other places. The only thing in the Bible that rules out life on other planets is what you see in Hebrews 9 and 10, which tells us that the creator of the universe, Jesus Christ, died one time, one place for all. That would indicate that Earth is unique in having intelligent spiritual beings that are in need of redemption. But that doesn't rule out God creating dolphins on a distant planet. That's a possibility. And if we find that, then we know that God performed miracles in two places, not just one place. And I've been on record since the 1980s. We will find the remains of life in virtually every solar system body, and especially on the moon. Why? Because Earth, every time it gets hit by a big meteorite, exports Earth soil throughout the solar system, and every ton of Earth soil contains 100 quadrillion microbes. So I think it's inevitable that we're going to find the remains of life, but it'll be the remains of Earth life on the moon, on Mars, the moons of Jupiter, and elsewhere in the solar system.
Truly amazing stuff. And what's great about you, Dr. Ross, is that you don't avoid those difficult questions. I've watched your debates with other scientists, but are there ever any questions or any topics that almost make you feel a bit uncomfortable and you sometimes have to say, I haven't got the answer?
Well, sometimes when I'm speaking, somebody will say, hey, can you comment on this paper that was published yesterday? And I'll have to say, look, I haven't read it yet. Let me read it before I comment. So, yeah, I get stumped like that on quite frequent occasions, especially on university campuses. But I always find that, hey, you can go back to the person and have a dialogue after you've done some serious study. And, yes, there are things happening in the scientific arena that are anomalies and problems for my Christian worldview. But what I've noticed over the decades is that as we learn more and more, those anomalies get resolved, and the anomalies get fewer in number and less problematic. That encourages me that the Christian faith really must be true. The fact that we see, as we explore the gaps of our ignorance, that the evidence gets stronger, it doesn't get weaker. Contrast with what I see, for example, in the origin of life community, who take an atheistic worldview. For them, their problems are getting bigger, more numerous, and more problematic, that's a clear sign you got the wrong model.
When we mentioned on the show that you would be a guest, I asked for questions and I was thinking that we may have several. We've had a lot of questions coming through, so we can't ask you them all because you haven't got time, but what we'll do is just pick a few of these. And the first one we'll start with is, in Genesis chapter 6, it talks about Nephilim. Who are they and how do we understand who they are?
Well, I wrote a whole chapter on the Nephilim in my book, Navigating Genesis, and there's also an appendix where I talk about 3 different theories in the Christian community to explain the Nephilim. It says that the sons of God came to the daughters of men, had physical intercourse with them, and that gave rise to the Nephilim. And this term, sons of God, can refer to angels or it can refer to human beings. I personally think it's referring to fallen angels or demons because humans are not referred to as sons of God until the Holy Spirit comes upon people and permanently baptizes them. And that doesn't happen until the day of Pentecost in the book of Acts. And since Genesis 6 precedes that by 1,500 years or more, then that means that the sons of God must be these fallen angels. And you see in the book of Jude that God condemned the angels who committed those vile acts to the abyss. And tells us in Jude 6 that these were angels that, quote, left their estate. And if you look at it in the original Greek, that would be synonymous with bestiality. So, and it's no surprise to me that Satan and the fallen angels would do this kind of thing because they're trying to destroy the image of God of humanity. And that's why you see such strong injunctions in the book of Leviticus against bestiality. I mean, I see nothing in the Bible that's got a stronger prohibition than that, and that's because God wants to preserve the image of God that he placed upon us human beings.
Another question in, the Bible states that evil came into the world because of Adam and Eve and the apple. If there hadn't have been any instance with the apple, would there have still have been evil in the world, or would we have had just heaven on earth and perfection on earth?
That's a good question. We need to realize that Adam was not the first sinner. The first sinner was Satan, and God could have kept Satan out of the Garden of Eden for all of eternity, and humanity would have been protected from the temptation that he offered. But I find it interesting that God permitted Satan to come into the garden. And I think that's confirmed by what God said to Adam when he brought Eve to her. He said, "This will be your helper." And the word helper in Hebrew actually means, here is your military ally. So when God created Eve, he was telling Adam and Eve, you are military allies, which means that God created them for battle. And I think he was referring to the spiritual battle they would have with Satan. And it's thanks to the entry of Satan into the Garden of Eden that we human beings have the potential of an eternally secure relationship with our Creator. Notice no one goes to the new creation until they've been tested by the greatest possible exposure to evil in God's creation. Satan's the most powerful creature that God ever made, and because we're being exposed to that creature and his temptations, we were being exposed to the most challenging tests. If we pass that test, nothing can ever threaten us ever again. And so Adam and Eve, if they had not been exposed to evil, yes, they would have been in the garden without sin, but there would always be the potential that, like Satan and the demons, they would rebel. They would not be eternally secure. It's through their exposure to Satan that a pathway was developed where they could become eternally secure with no potential of ever sinning or committing evil, and yet having their free will intact and their capacity to love intact. So Satan is actually a tool in God's hands to bring about a greater good.
In a recent BBC programme, it seemed to show that certain animals, like chimps, have empathy and many human characteristics. But how far away are we from animals? Because sometimes these programmes can make us think that the only difference between a chimp and a human being is that they've got a different face and extra fur.
Well, good question. Genesis tells us that God created the nephesh animals, the birds and mammals and higher reptilian species that are able to form an emotional relationship with us human beings. And then he also says he created us. As you look at the book of Job, it tells us that God created these higher animals to serve and to please us. We are a higher species. Likewise, he created us to serve and please a higher being, namely God. And so we shouldn't be surprised that these animals share a lot of features with us. Like us, they have a mind. Like us, they have emotions. Like us, they have the capability of having emotionally bonded relationships. However, it was Charles Darwin who said that because we're physically closest to the chimps will have features of the mind that are closest to us. But actually, biological research refutes that. The animals that are closest to us in manifesting intellectual capabilities are not the great apes. They're birds. It's ravens and crows, corvids, the jays. These are the smartest animals, non-human animals on the planet. And no evolutionist would say that we have a recent common ancestor with the birds. So this is a clear case where the evolutionary model got it wrong, but where the biblical model got it correct. And we're told in the Bible, look to the birds, they'll teach you. Look to the beasts of the field, they'll instruct you. They'll instruct you about who you are relative to God and who you are relative to these birds and these mammals. And the point is, we human beings are exceptional. Of all the animals on the planet, we're the only ones that have symbolic capability. We're the only ones that can recognize what a stop sign means. We're the only ones that can develop an alphabet or a number system and begin to read and do mathematics. No non-human animal is capable of reading a book, for example.
As human beings, we are very close to certain animals, I'd say dogs and cats being the main ones. But are we to believe, and is this biblical, that animals go to heaven as well as human beings?
Well, what the Bible tells us is that all spiritual beings, once created, live forever. So the angels live forever. We human beings live forever. However, the birds and mammals, the dogs and cats, are not spiritual beings. And therefore there's no biblical guarantee that they will live forever. On the other hand, I think there could well be animals in the new creation, but they may not be the animals that we have relationships with here on Earth. And I think God purposely designed these animals to strongly bond with us emotionally. And when they die, we feel the pain of that broken relationship. Well, notice that Jesus died on the cross for us because of our broken relationship with Him. So in that sense, I think the birds teach us something, the animals teach us something, that just like we feel the pain of that broken, bonded relationship, likewise God feels the pain when we run away from Him instead of towards Him.
A few questions now from concerned parents, and the first one comes in from Paul, who's got a son who's 12 years old, and he says, how do we argue that Jonah and the whale could actually happen? My son came home from school and he'd been told by his teacher that it's simply a myth and it didn't actually happen.
Well, something happened that caused all the citizens of Nineveh to repent, and there's nothing like seeing a man with stains all over his body from being inside a big animal. And incidentally, it doesn't say that it's a whale, just that it's a big sea animal. So we're not really certain what kind of animal it was, but, there are creatures in the sea with mouths big enough that they could hold a human being, and they keep them on the surface of the water for a long enough period of time, then spit them out on a beach. So there's nothing in the story that's scientifically impossible. Something happened dramatic that caused all those people in Nineveh to repent. So I would argue there's no scientific proof for the story, but there's no scientific proof against the story. And something happened that made Nineveh repent to that degree. So there is that historical evidence that we have to deal with.
Our next question comes in from Kefu, and he says, how do I explain the truth of the story of the plagues in the Old Testament to my 9-year-old son, who again came home from school to say that during their study of Egypt, their teacher said to them that the plagues are myths and not true?
Well, something had to happen to explain the dramatic collapse of the Egyptian empire. I mean, it wasn't just the Jewish slaves leaving Egypt. And notice how big a population left Egypt to go to the land of Israel. The text tells us many Egyptians joined in with the Jewish people. So many Egyptians chose to become Jews as a result of what was happening before them. So clearly something dramatic was going on. Again, we don't have clear scientific proof that each of those plagues actually happened, but we do have historical evidence that a huge catastrophe befell the Egyptian empire, and a huge number of Egyptians decided to leave Egypt and join the Jewish people. So yes, I think it's inappropriate for the teacher to say that there's no credibility to the account in Genesis. Something had to happen to explain the historical events.
Now, bear with me on this next question, because it seems as though Jim probably has some scientific background. So he says that at a recent Christian seminar led by Dr. Dennis Alexandra, who's a biologist, he confirmed to me that not only is evolution compatible with the Christian faith, but evolution is real. And Jim's question is, how can evolution be reconciled with the second law of thermodynamics? And why do we not see spontaneous healing of DNA that is damaged, or spontaneous development of cancer?
Yeah, very good question. There's no doubt that life has been here on planet Earth for 3.8 billion years. It started off simple. It's now complex. And, people have speculated that maybe that progression from simplicity to complexity happened naturalistically without any divine miraculous intervention. Your questioner made a good point, though. If you got thermodynamics and entropy operating, given the complexity that came from this simple life, given the fact that there is no naturalistic pathway that can conceivably explain the origin of life, how can it be purely naturalistic? And I think one way to put this to a scientific test, the Bible says for 6 days God created. On the seventh day, he stopped. He ceased from his work of creation. We're in the seventh day right now. The 6 days are the ages that preceded humanity, which means that scientifically, if the Bible is credible, we're going to see a difference in biology in the human era than we do in the pre-human era. And there's actually experiments that are taking place where they're called long-term evolution experiments, where they look at bacteria which have the highest probability of any naturalistic change, studying them in the laboratory and saying, what can we see happening? And then compare that to what we see in the fossil record. And those experiments tells us that there's a huge dichotomy. That, for example, we see many examples of repeated design outcomes in the world of nature. But when we do experiments in the laboratory in bacteria, we don't see the repetition that we see. So clearly something different was going on in the pre-human era than the post-human era. And I would say just look at the origin of life. When you look at the origin of life on planet Earth, number one, many of the critical ingredients, the building blocks for the DNA, the RNA, and the proteins are missing on the Earth. In fact, they're missing everywhere in the entirety of the universe. And we also notice that the origin of life took place in a geologic instant. If you don't have the building blocks and you don't have time, you don't have a naturalistic model for the origin of life. This is clearly an instance when God supernaturally intervened. And I would argue that the origin of life is the simplest problem for the evolutionists to solve. Everything beyond that is orders of magnitude more complex. And the other thing we notice is every event in the history of life over the past 3.8 billion years, every life form, every event fulfills a critical role in making possible the redemption of billions of human beings within a 10,000-year wide window. This is clear evidence of intentionality and purpose, not mindless evolution.
Well, Dr. Ross, it's been an absolute joy and a pleasure. Thank you so much because, as we said at the start of the interview, you're writing 4 books, so you haven't got much free time. But thank you for your time, and also thank you for helping us to defend our faith, because it is minds like yours which helps us answer those difficult questions.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.